Okay, this is a video for topic 5.8, the reactions to the industrial economy. And what we're after here is the conditions that led to, changes, people to call for changes, and what new isms emerged. So when we look at what we're supposed to learn, our essential question is what caused the calls for changes in the industrial society? Meaning that what were the negatives of the conditions of the workers and the owners that led to new ideas? And these ideas are going to be called isms, and they're going to emerge and compete. So the very first thing we need to answer is what were the issues? Then we need to kind of look at each of the isms, and there's going to be four of them and why they developed, and also pay attention to who they supported. We want to describe them and we want to explain how they sought to solve the issues of the Industrial Revolution. Now, a little bit of a side note. In this video, I'm going to be talking about topics such as socialism and communism. And from this aspect, I'm talking about them as in the line of history. We all know that the true and the best government slash economic system is a mixed economy, but we also need to understand the context which these developed in to be able to understand the evolution of history. So, when we look at the issues caused by the Industrial Revolution, now we're talking about the issues on people. And the first thing was the unequal distribution of wealth. Laissez-faire capitalism allows people to essentially have tons and tons of money and the wealth not to be equally distributed between the owners and the workers. And that's going to be something key that I'm going to talk about. Even today, this remains. I don't know if you know that 90% of the wealth of the world is held by only 10% of the population. Next, the living and the working conditions of the workers is absolutely horrible. Anytime any housing reforms, water reforms, factory rules come up, the owners argue that it puts them at a disadvantage and essentially makes the workers, feel bad for asking for them. But when we talk about living conditions, we're talking about horrible housing, a lack of water. We're talking about working conditions such as incredibly long hours. We're talking about child labor. We're talking about low wages, no job security, things like that. Also, a free market capitalist economy is incredibly volatile. And what I'm talking about here is recessions and depressions. These happen a lot. As a matter of fact, in the 19th century, there were three times where the economy crashed. Now, when an economy crashes, that means everybody loses their money, especially the owners, but workers are out of work as well. Prices go high and things are bad. And then finally, there's a ton of environmental damage. Now, out of these isms sought to address the unequal distribution of wealth, distributing the more between workers and owners, sought to reform living and working conditions. That's where the success really lies, and sought to stabilize the economy. None of them really attacked environmental damage until much later. So, what is an ism? We've identified the problems. Now we got to identify the proposed solutions. And an ism is a political slash economic system that is designed to behave under the laws of the economy and to make life better. What we want is an organization of the economy that is going to give profits, but is also not going to take care of its workers. And these isms are going to become very, very class oriented, meaning that if I'm in the owning class, I'm going to believe in the political ism of probably classical liberalism and the economic ism of capitalism. Whereas if I'm a worker, I'm probably going to lean towards socialism and communism as a political slash economic system because it gives me more profits, more wages, better living and working conditions. This is just the challenge that's going on. So when we look at them, they all center around these 8 questions. So I want you to read them and I want you to decide, do I agree or disagree? And we're going to discuss these really quick. Okay. So number 1 talks about ownership. Do you want the owners owning the factors of productions, or do you want them to be owned more communicatively? A better way to put it would be essentially, which is more important in a factory or a business, the owner or the workers? Number 2 basically focuses on economic freedom. And essentially, I think that for the most part, everybody would agree with that. But this falls into the isms because it's whose self interests are rewarded and whose are denied. Now, then we get into the government role. And the government job is obviously to protect its citizens, and workers are citizens. What do they do, and to what degree do they protect their workers against the owners? And how do they protect the owners? Now, the fourth one, again, it goes back to ownership. Who's going to own the factors of production? And then also, number 5, should the government be involved and to what level? Now, number 6 really is talking about, are we distributing things to people that can afford them or need them? You might, in college, have to go to an internship that is 20 miles away from your college. And if you don't have a car, you're going to be denied the opportunity to participate in that. Is your need outweighing that idea that you should work hard and earn a car? And then we talk about competition and progress. So these are things that these isms are striving to answer. And whether you agree or disagree with them doesn't mean you're one or the other. It's just what these people are talking about and trying to answer in order to create a better life. So when you take notes, this is what I would suggest. These are the 4 isms we're going to talk about. 2 fall under capitalism, one is laissez-faire, and one is utilitarianism. Then 2 fall under socialism, which is utopian socialism and Marxism. Now, I chose not to cover really a mixed capitalist economy, and that's what we have today, because it really didn't emerge until after this time period. And it actually emerged because of this time period. So we begin with capitalism, and we've already talked about capitalism in topics 5.1 and later 5.7. And essentially, here's the definition. It's focused on private ownership of the means of production. And because of the private ownership, what we're focusing on is the owner taking the risk and receiving a majority of the profits. This was created by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations and focuses on 3 main things. 1, economic freedom, meaning that people have the economic freedom to make decisions about what to buy and how to conduct their business without government involvement. That individuals are allowed to pursue their own interests, and if they're not good, literally fall down in class because they're not good at it. And then finally, allowing the rules of supply and demand to create equilibrium to create the economy. Now, as we saw before, this is a very good economic system because it does establish the best price for goods and services and really rewards innovation. But first of all, it creates a great deal of inequality. This favors the owners because the owners are taking the risk. And when it comes down to a dispute between workers and owners about wages or safety, they're always going to lean toward the owners because of the expense involved. Literally, owners, they're not free to do whatever they want because they'll lose out. And an owner, just like a worker, can lose his fortune and his job very quickly. The other thing is that there's a lot of external costs in terms of, harm to labor, harm to the environment, things like that. So on one hand, this is good for the owners and good for the world economy, but it also has some negatives. Now, future capitalists after Smith began to also add to the theory. Thomas Malthus, the great population philosopher, really much predicted that population is going to essentially outgrow food supply very quickly. And what he's arguing is that things like disease, death, and things like that were natural checks on the population. David Ricardo argues that, hey, there's always poor people. And no matter how high you raise wages, essentially what's going to happen, there's always going to be that group that's making the least. And you can do nothing about it except use them for cheap labor. And with cheap labor, we have successful business and more money flowing through the economy. Now, both of these thinkers are opposed to government welfare, government payouts to make the workers better. The reason is because they take away a natural check in the population or a motivation to do a better job. And according to Ricardo, anytime you raise wages and give people money, there's still going to be poor people no matter what you do. So this is capitalism. Now, the urbanization is going to lead to a lot of problems, as we established before. And laissez-faire capitalism ruled the roost for a long time. But starting in the late 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, there was a lot of calls for change. Workers, who make up the majority, began to protest and began to form unions to protect themselves. So, some other economic thinkers are going to come up with alternatives to the free market system. The first one was utilitarianism. Now, this is going to sound a little weird, but it really isn't. It'll make sense once I get through it. Utilitarianism is essentially that any decision should be made to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So, when you're weighing whether to implement child labor laws or minimum wage or worker safety conditions, if it's going to be the greatest good for the greatest number of people, it's a good thing. If it's not going to meet that criteria, it's not. Now, what we're doing here is we're reforming capitalism. We're not changing it. And this is based on the principle of utility. Same thing. Anything is useful. And that they even worked out a new version of calculus to kind of calculate the things that essentially you should do to limit the suffering and allow for more happiness. So when we look at this, and again, this is the mathematical formula, okay? Utilitarianism, if we all do good and stop crime, that is a moral value. That's a good moral value, okay? If we're doing other things, we get pluses and minuses. So as you can see from this little image here, return a briefcase used to bribe a politician. Well, that's bad because he's being bribed. Okay, bribe caused a company to get a government contract. Well, that's kind of a 50-50 because the bribe is bad, but at least it puts more people to work. As you can see, what we're trying to do is reform capitalism to make it fairer to the workers, to make it better, and to solve some of these problems. So the leading utilitarians, there's two of them. One is Jeremy Bentham, who sought straight up to reform capitalism through government involvement. And he believed that individual freedom and democracy created happiness, that if we were to really extend fairness and rights to everybody in the workplace, overall everybody would be happier. And then we have John Stuart Mill, who essentially said, look, business owners have the right to make a profit, have a right to do things, but they shouldn't do it at the expense of the workers. Imagine an owner who owns a factory who really overworks his workers, causing long hours, a lot of death, a lot of destruction. Well, he might be very profitable and bring in lots of wealth, but look at the expense there. That's not the greatest good for the greatest amount. Then we have the utopian socialists. Now, socialism essentially means greater government involvement in the economy to make things more equal. That is it in its nutshell. We're not going to kind of get into today's version of socialism because it's been kind of twisted around. But the utopian socialists who you read about, what they did is they saw an ideal world. So this is not reforming capitalism, this is expanding it. So when we put the two worlds together, utopian means the ideal world. So what you're doing is you're creating these ideal little communities where everybody's working together, but there's still some private ownership. So as you can see, socialism is a system in which the society as a whole, rather than individuals, has some ownership of the means or the factors of production. But in utopian socialism, there is some private ownership. So you read about Owen, Saint Simon, and Fourier. These guys were the leading utopian socialists, and all of them sought to create these unique little communities that essentially would work together, owning the factors of production, but also allowing for some private ownership. So, for example, if we were in if our classroom was a utopian society, we would have a factory that we would all have ownership and we would share the profits. Yes, there would be some experts who were a little bit more favored and paid, but all in all, we would seek to not equally share the profits, but share the profits. But also, if you had a vegetable garden or you could make stuff like shoes, you would also be allowed to sell those on the side. So it's kind of a balance. And what this is specifically to address poverty and the gap between rich and poor. The key to utopian socialism is cooperation, not competition, whereas the key to capitalism is competition to bring out the best. Then we have Marxism, and this is communism, Marxism, and essentially this was created by Friedrich Engels, but the main brain behind it is this guy right here, Karl Marx. Marxism, also known as communism, basically rejects all this stuff. And he uses a very scientific view on the development of the Industrial Revolution and the plight of the workers. This is why it's also called scientific socialism. So, what he's arguing is that if you look back in history, history is always a class struggle. Okay, you had nobility versus the lower classes, you had nobility versus the merchant class. Now you have owners versus workers. Those are the classes involved. And in his book, The Communist Manifesto to the Right, he argues that today the factory owners, being the bourgeoisie, were fighting against the proletariat, the workers. So he's looking at free market capitalism and he's saying, wait a minute, the factory owners, being the bourgeoisie, they're the haves and the workers are the have nots. So he's trying to answer that question, which is more important, the owner or the worker? And he's literally arguing the worker. But he's also saying, hey, wait a minute here. This is a natural process to go to pure worker rule. So what he calls for is a workers' revolution. And in the Communist Manifesto and later his other work, Das Kapital, which is a very long book and it's a good read, but unless you're interested, I wouldn't read it. Basically, he argues this: workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. So, what he's arguing is this: the movement to capitalism, laissez faire capitalism, and then the movement to a little bit of socialism was a natural flow of history. That the next stage, there would be a proletariat workers' revolution that essentially would rise up and the workers would take over ownership of the factors of production and share the profit between them. So, to kind of give you an example of where Marx is coming from, what he's arguing is that the bourgeoisie up above, dancing and partying, remember, they're the factory owners, are all being successful on the work, the blood, and the tears of the workers. And that the workers should rise up, maintain, achieve their position because labor is more important than a factory, than ownership. So when we break it down, remember that communism is part of socialism. Capitalism being utilitarianism and laissez-faire capitalism. Individuals and businesses own property and the means of production. In utilitarianism, it's kind of community owned, and laissez-faire capitalism, it's individual owned. Whereas in socialism, the community or the government should own the means of production. In Marxism, the government will seize ownership of the means of production because the government is the government of the workers. That progress results in capitalism when basically individuals follow their own self-interest. But in socialism, progress comes from cooperation for the good of everybody or the good of the workers. Businesses follow their own self-interest and compete. They try to produce goods and services that are less expensive. But under socialism, capitalist employers, the owners, they take advantage of workers. I mean, literally, Marx accused the bourgeoisie, the factory owners, of murder of the workers. So he's arguing that the community or the state, they have the responsibility, and so forth and so on. You pretty much get the gist of this. Well, to make a long story short, is this: these are the four isms, and none of them were really adopted. What happens is that governments realize the situation and begin to strike a balance. They continue to allow factory owners to own the means of productions, but then they pass laws such as minimum wage laws, welfare laws, working condition laws, which protect the worker. That they allow the market to be determined by supply and demand, but they also regulate the economy to make sure it's fair to the workers. So, what I'm saying is that a combination of these kind of emerges. And ultimately, the thing that really kind of settled this down was the extension of voting rights to everybody so they could vote in people that would match their policy. So, this was about what caused the calls for changes in the industrial society and what new isms emerged. So, essentially, the main issues were this: okay, low wages, long hours, horrible living and working conditions, the volatile economy, and finally, environmental damage. And three of those were really addressed where environmental damage really wasn't paid attention to. That isms are developed to try to make the best economy. They range on the right from the capitalist versions of laissez-faire capitalism and utilitarianism, where they favor private or group ownership, but they still maintain that idea of supply and demand, versus the socialists, the utopian socialists and the Marxists that call for community or government slash worker ownership of the means of production. So we just kind of described them. Well, how did they attempt to solve the issues? Well, capitalism was, you can't really solve them because this is the best. Utilitarianism, hey, we're going to make some people more equal, give them a little bit better life. Socialism, utopian socialism, we're going to community own and share. And then finally, Marxism, the workers are going to own it all. So they solved them by ownership and what they did, who they put in power.